Welcome to the Next Generation Rockstars podcast. If you are trying to figure out how do you recruit and retain this next generation of rockstar talent, well, you are in the right place. Hi, this is Amanda Hammett at the Millennial Translator, and today I have a super amazing and just chock full of information interview for you. I had Kat Cole, who is the COO and President of North America for Focus Brands, on the show. And on the show, she talks about so much information that I really think that you need a notebook before you start in on this episode. Or if you're listening while you commute, you're going to definitely want to come back and listen to this one a second, maybe even a third time, because it is just that chock full of information. In fact, she might even want to teach a leadership class for MBA students. It is that good. So hope you're tuning in, and we will talk to you soon. Hi, this is Amanda Hammett, and today we have a very special guest for Next Generation Rockstars. Her name is Kat Cole, and she is the COO and President of North America for Focus Brands. Now, you may not be aware of Focus Brands, but I know that you know their products, things like Cinnabon and Auntie Anne's and Jamba Juice, just to name a few. So Kat, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All right. So Kat, tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I run a large company called Focus that is a franchisor and licensor of some of the world's most famous food franchises, from the fun for you indulgent brands like Cinnabon and Carvel to the lunch and dinner brands, kind of more family concepts like Moe's and McAllister's and Schlotzsky's, all the way to the healthier side of the spectrum with Jamba Juice. I've grown up in this business versions of it since I was 17 years old. I started out as a hostess at Hooters restaurants. I became a waitress at 18. At 19, I started opening franchises around the world. By 26, I was vice president of the company, doing 800 million in revenue, helped grow the company around the world, which was an amazing experience, and then left to become president of Cinnabon at the age of 31, and helped turn that company around out of the recession, grew it into a really fantastic global multi-channel brand. And then moved up as the company grew and became group president of the licensing division, and then the role that I've had for the last 2 years as president and COO of the company. I am a mom of an 18-month-old. I am almost 6 months pregnant with my second. Married the love of my life several years ago. And so just sort of like many people, juggling it all. But part of my role is I manage presidents. The presidents report to me in the company. But the way we build businesses is by hiring talent that is seriously multi-generational. Yeah. And so I get to, not only have I typically been the youngest person in the room at almost every stage in my career, but really get to see and experience and mentor and develop people of all generations, and certainly the largest influx of those being millennial and Gen Z, into various positions and levels throughout the company. So excited to cover this topic.
That is awesome. I'm so excited. So let's backtrack a little bit on your history really quick. You mentioned opening international franchises at the age of 19. That is an awful lot of responsibility for a 19-year-old. And a lot of people would probably be like, that was a crazy decision. But I think it worked out well for Hooters. I think that they made a good call there. Yeah. But you also opened multiple new franchises in new countries and new cultures. And I would imagine that did something to your leadership style, because you were working with one group 1 month and then 6 weeks later, a completely new group. What did that teach you in that process?
What's interesting is when you are traveling to a new place with a new culture and a new team, what you learn very quickly, what I learned very quickly, is that I was the only common denominator. And so if things went well consistently, I could probably take some credit for those things going consistently well.
Right.
But if things were not going well consistently in an area, I probably also needed to take responsibility and realize that likely had something to do with me. And the first time I opened a franchise when I was 19 and I was in Australia. Certain things went wrong, and a lot went right, but certain things went wrong. And I thought, oh, well, that's just because the concept is new. Well, that's just because they don't know. And then the next country, I would have a similar observations. And in the third country, which was actually also the third continent, I realized, there's probably something I could do different to create a different outcome. So that was the first thing, is that experience was a brutal yet beautiful leadership mirror that most people don't ever experience because they get comfortable. People learn your style. They say, well, that's just her, right? That she doesn't mean that. People learn you and you learn them. And so you can get away with having less than stellar leadership behaviors and communication skills.
That's awesome.
Because people give you wiggle room. They learn that you're pretty much a good person. And so they figure it out. But when you have to be amazing over and over and over again with teams you've never met, it really does sharpen the skills of building trust and communication and giving clear direction and building teams.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about that idea of building trust, because that is something that I see as an underlying issue in almost any company I go in to consult with or talk to or anything, is that they make the assumption that they have it, but they don't always have it. So what does trust look like for you today in a working environment?
I think I don't know that it's changed much over time. Certainly there are some fundamentals.
Yes.
One is people feeling safe.
Yes.
And whether that's psychological safety or emotional safety or physical safety, but the underlying belief that at a minimum, I'm not at risk. That I'm safe is important. And I think that might be a nuance that is more prominent in today's world than maybe a decade or 2 decades ago. And so that's one foundational component. The other is that I understand and can anticipate in general things that are going to happen. Said another way, people around me do what they say they're going to do.
Yes.
And that's also connected to psychological safety.
Yes.
Because I believe I'm not putting myself at risk because you've given me evidence that I can depend on or rely on, or use the word trust, you or the environment or what is said. And so that's the second component. The third is just this element of care. And one of the ways when I was opening stores around the world that I learned to build trust was I would bring donuts and coffee. And that may seem silly, and it's not bribing. It was demonstrating through my actions that I thought of the team first thing in the morning.
Yes.
I didn't have to show up and say, hey, everyone, I thought of you today, right? I showed up early. I got the restaurant ready. I brought coffee and donuts. That alone says I care about you. I'm thinking of you. I don't want you to be distracted because you're hungry. I want you to be delighted because there's a surprise for you. So all of those things are incredibly important in building trust.
Absolutely. And that one small act actually, I'm sure, showed your employees, hey, she doesn't just say she cares about me, she actually does. And this is how she demonstrates it. So I think that's wonderful. So why don't you share with the audience your general idea? You don't have to get into the nuts and bolts of it, but the general idea around developing next generation talent.
I think there are a few pieces that are important in developing next generation talent. One is being candid with them to make sure they see and understand any behaviors that they might be displaying that are distracting from their potential. So it's candor. And that helps someone learn lessons sooner than they otherwise would through longer, more painful processes and mistakes. So that's one way I think about
Yes.
developing next generation of talent.
Yes. Yes.
So it's the what can you do for
Mhm.
yourself, and then what can I do or what can we do for you? So on the what can you do, are you self-aware?
Yeah.
And if you're self-aware, are you then also aware of how to address it? So if something you're doing or saying is problematic or suboptimal or holding you back or
Right.
unintentionally distracting from your professionalism, if you acknowledge it, do you know what the counter behaviors are to address it? So that's a big first step in
Yes.
developing next generation talent. The second is on the what can I do? What can we do? So giving them exposure
Right.
to many unique learning opportunities, bring them into a piece of a meeting so they can see it and get perspective. Challenge them to do research on other areas of the business that round out their mindset and their perspective around the business. Put them with new teams regularly so
Yes.
that they have to feel uncomfortable in a productive way, because that builds confidence,
Yes.
also drives learning. And then the third piece is literally giving people a chance, not haphazardly. I have a business to run. I have investors and franchisees, and I can't randomly stick people in positions. But certainly when I see potential, if I've given them exposure, if they are very self-aware, if they're good learners and they're comfortable with iterating their behaviors, they deserve a shot. I mean, I was opening restaurants at 19. I was vice president at 26. A lot of people gave me a chance, and you can't remove that piece from the equation. But I was also a calculated risk. They gave me a chance, but I demonstrated so many behaviors that suggested that even if I didn't know something, I would have the grit, the resilience, the resourcefulness to figure it out. So when you see people like that, no matter the generation, whether they're much older or much younger, give them a shot. Because it's better to have someone like that in a role than someone you just think has the experience but isn't resourceful and isn't scrappy and gets stuck very easily. And in today's environment with such dynamic shifts happening in every sector, resourcefulness is a far more valued skill than experience purely, because it's really more important to have the right questions than the right answers, because if you had the right answers 6 months ago, they're not right today, most likely. So those are some approaches that I take to developing the next generation of talent.
That's amazing. I mean, I think that's what every young employee needs to be looking for, is a leader who is thinking the way that you're thinking. And I appreciate that. And I love that. I'd like to pivot just for a quick second. I still speak at the university and college level frequently. And one of the things that I see and hear and experience from them is this anxiety around their career path and having it all figured out.
Yeah.
And I would say that your path has been non-traditional. And I love it. And I think that it's something that should be celebrated, but I'd like for you to tell our younger listeners about your path.
Sure. So one, I agree. I do a lot of speaking with at colleges and universities, and I sense the same thing from men and women. A little more with women. But I don't know that it's a new dynamic. I'm assuming that people who have sort of matriculated through college and they're nearing graduation, I would know, I dropped out of college when I was 20, but that they start to feel a lot of pressure for what am I going to turn this education into, especially if they are in premier or Ivy League schools. And there is a tremendous amount of the perfection paradox swirling around people. And so for me, my story, as one of many examples out there of non-traditional paths, I grew up as the child of a single parent. We left my dad. He was an alcoholic. I helped raise my sisters. I was the first person in my family to ever get into college. I was electrical engineering and computer sciences major, psychology of women minor. And then but I had to work to pay for school.
Yeah.
Student debt or loans wasn't even a topic. It wasn't even available.
Right.
I mean, I know some people had them, but I didn't have access to it. And so I had to work to pay for everything outright. And that was working in restaurants, like a lot of students do, 1 out of 2, actually. And and so what was unique is that I really was so proud that I was the first person in my family to get into college, and I believed I was going to become an attorney. Thought I was going to get the engineering degrees and then go to law school and become an attorney, maybe a patent attorney or some type of a lawyer for a large corporation. That was my fuzzy dream that was inspired by, I don't know, television shows and teachers and things like that. But then I started training new employees as a waitress in my home restaurant in Jacksonville, Florida. And then I started traveling to open restaurants and realized I was very good at this kind of complicated thing. Yeah. Much more easily than others were. And so I was 18, I was 19, I was 20, you know, I'm traveling around training teams, hiring employees, training managers. And I myself had been an employee in those situations. So I had learned from good managers and from bad managers. And I just realized that I was pretty good at it. I didn't think I was perfect. I didn't think I knew everything, but it was obvious that I was naturally good at it. I was fortunate to be put in a situation where I could feel that I did more with less effort than others in this area. And I think it's important for people to tune in to their energies and to pay attention when they have those moments, no matter what it is, whether it's playing an instrument or being a nanny or, you know, working with kids or education or whatever, that you pay attention and you go, wow, it's not being conceited. It's saying I'm recognizing I'm pretty good at this and I have barely any experience and I love it. Yes. And so that was the feeling I had when I was opening franchises and training employees. And I got a lot of feedback that also suggested that. And so I leaned into it. I kept saying yes. When the company said, will you go travel? When they said, will you go travel to Australia? I had never been on a plane and I did not have a passport and I had never opened a restaurant in my life, but I said yes. Not because I thought, I wasn't delusional. I didn't think I knew how to do that. Right. I was confident in my ability to ask for help and to take risks. And so I bought my first plane ticket, flew to Miami, stood in line, got a passport expedited and left a few weeks later to Australia. And I thought it would never happen again. And I made up my classes. And then they asked 6 months later, will you go do the same thing in Central America? And then several months later, will you go do the same thing in South America? And eventually I was leading these teams, not just a member of the teams, but I was also failing college. So I dropped out of college because I was literally failing. I was never there. It wasn't like I wanted to leave college. Right. My mom was very upset. But I then got a job offer to move to Atlanta and work in the corporate office as a 20-year-old overseeing all employee training. So I said yes to that. Yeah. And I moved up as the company, you know, as the company grew, I grew. And joining a growing company matters because there's disproportionate opportunities available, especially for people who might have less experience. So I moved up, but all through that process of moving up as a young corporate professional, I was volunteering my time for community organizations. I was volunteering my time for industry associations like the National Restaurant Association and the Georgia Restaurant Association. And those things brought me connections, gave me additional leadership experience in the nonprofit sector, which is an important layer of leadership. And it helped me have confidence because I was dealing with so many different scenarios at the same time. I was working on fundraising initiatives for the nonprofit. Then I would come to work and work on training new employees and launching a new menu item. And it made my skill set very robust, very fast. And that combination of my day job, my nonprofit side hustle, really helped round out my skills. And I was vice president at 26. As I mentioned, the company was doing 800 million in revenue. The CEO passed away suddenly. The whole executive team almost turned over. We owned an airline. We sold an airline. I mean, it was a bananas crazy period. But I was learning, and learning I knew was my currency.
Right.
And I stayed there in that company for 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
But every 3 years, it was like a completely different company. And every 2 years, I had a different job.
Yes.
So it was perfect for
Right.
me, and it prepared me to be a president of a large enterprise. But there's a lot of things that are non-traditional in there. And everybody has their path. And I guess because I didn't sit in a college environment waiting until the end with this huge weight of what will I do next. I jumped right into something because I had a compelling alternative. But if you don't have a compelling alternative, stay in school, like finish the degree, because it's one of the greatest enablers and privileges in the world. But I had a compelling alternative that happened to come my way to keep opening restaurants around the world. I did later go back and get an MBA. So I have a master's without a bachelor's. It is rare but possible through executive MBA program. So I further evidence that I deeply respect higher education.
Yes.
But I also follow my own path. And a lot of people like to say, wow, you're clearly so ambitious. I've never been ambitious, not by the technical or typical sense of the word. I've always been very positive and opportunistic. And so when an opportunity came, I was ready because I was working my ass off. And then I jumped in and said yes. So that was a bit more my path. That's not everyone. Some people are big planners and say, I want to be a CEO, and then they work their way back. And that's an amazing way to plan your future as well. Just give yourself the flexibility to make exceptions when opportunities come up.
Yes, I agree. I agree. You know, the one thing that the two things I really took away from your story is that three. Okay. The learning was number one for you always, but you were always willing to take risks, which a lot of people would have shied away from some of those risks that you took. But the third thing is that you might have had some missteps here and there, but you figured it out and you kept on going. And that's important. So that's grit, resilience. It took everything. That's awesome. All right. So Kat, when you think about young talent, so again, millennials, Gen Z, what do you really think about their abilities? Because they're in the media, in corporate America, there's a lot of talk of doom and gloom. It's not what I see, and it's not what the numbers are showing me, but what do you?
First of all, it's millennials and Gen Z. If you put them together, I might have my math wrong, but it's probably close to half of the population. And so I don't know how you could even talk about a group that large as having any defined set of characteristics that are any different from humans. So
Thank you.
So that's always really interesting. Even the millennial generation alone is so massive.
It is.
That there's clear evidence that sort of the younger millennials that are closer to Gen Z, or the earlier half, and elder millennials, to use the fabulous comedian Eliza's stand-up words, elder millennial, are closer to Gen X. I'm a Zennial, so I'm on some studies, the few studies that include 1978, in a millennial, then I like those because I get to say I'm a millennial. But I'm a cusper.
Me too.
And I certainly relate to both. And so that's my first opinion, is talking about such a giant swath of the population and then trying to define their characteristics is a bit of a fool's errand. What I will say is that, and what has always been true of every next generation coming into the workplace, is that they are critical of the generations that have preceded them, because they are dealing with the downside effects of whatever their parents and their grandparents as a generation produced. And that's always been true.
Absolutely.
Always. And that's not new. And so I don't find it particularly unique or concerning or difficult. I do believe that because Gen Z and the younger millennials are true digital natives, have never known a world without an iPhone, as even a child, or other types of technology, have not known a world without the internet. They are quite possibly the most resourceful generations. that we've seen to date because of the abundant access to information to them. It's just like, of course I can find that out. Of course I can research that. In fact, when I meet a younger professional that isn't resourceful, I almost hold them to an unfair standard where I'm like, what do you mean send you the link? Google it. Like what, why would you tell them? I just had, my husband was telling me a story about a younger person who, was asking for somebody to send a link, and they're like, why wouldn't you just Google it? It's so weird to hear a young person ask for that. It's something a 50-year-old should ask for, not a 19-year-old. So they are in general more resourceful. And so the question is how to leverage that. Certainly because technology is the first filter, there are other downside effects, things like low confidence, imposter syndrome because of the Instagram generation and comparing their day-to-day real life to someone's highlights and posts. So that's very real. It's a very real psychological component and trade-off for all the upsides. And when I find older generations saying the younger generations are that describe them as, what about me? It's all about me. That's a bit shaped by the fact that everyone is kind of a celebrity in their own worlds through social media platforms. And so it is the creation of their environment. And so I'm also not critical of that. I just wonder how to leverage that, how to use that. So resourcefulness, they're a bit of a celebrity. Everyone's an influencer in their own way. And so again, how do I use that? And then yes, there does tend to be less experience in deep interpersonal conflict and interpersonal interactions. There aren't the typical coping mechanisms that earlier generations absolutely came about naturally because they did have to deal with everything face-to-face, voice-to-voice. And so that's absolutely true. So there are upsides and there are downsides, just like with any generation.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. So I would say that you're a rock star. I mean, I'm just going to go out there and say that, but how do you identify someone else who is a rock star or potentially has rock star abilities that maybe have not been uncovered?
I look for grit and resourcefulness. I mean, that is because if someone doesn't have that and they're a rock star right now, they won't be in a different situation. They're just a rock star because they've they know the environment so well, or they've done one thing incredibly well, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if the question is, what is a rock star? A rock star is not someone just being singularly amazing,
right?
But rather on the business side, someone who I could put in on 4 different teams on 3 different projects, and because they know how to ask the right questions, treat people with respect, collaborate, they have courage to speak out and speak their mind. I mean, these are super translatable rock star attributes that will allow someone to be relatively successful in most scenarios. I don't expect the impossible of anyone, not even of myself. But certainly those are the things that I have learned are the hallmarks of someone who could be a rock star. I was just meeting with a team member in our office yesterday who wanted to talk about her career and what she was thinking, and what was next for her. And truly, and it's such a pleasure when you can give someone this feedback. I said, I know I could put you in several different situations and maybe even a few different departments, and you'd probably be able to figure it out. And that means the world is your banana. You're going to have so many options. And that's not the case for people who haven't figured out how to navigate diverse environments. So that's a bit of what I think a rock star is.
Right. That is so right on. Absolutely. I think that's what every leader really needs to be focusing in on, is just not looking at the resume, so to speak, but really looking at what are those qualities that this person has. So, all right. So what I have and what I deal with a lot are leaders who come to me and they're frustrated and they are exasperated and they are pulling their hair out. And again, it's back to these, I don't get these kids, these millennials are the worst. bless them when Gen Z really hits full force into the workforce for them. But what advice would you give sitting in your office to an older leader who is really struggling in that way with a younger employee?
So I start with the same approach that I would with a younger employee is first, what can you do differently? And then what might they be able to do differently? And so on the look in the mirror first conversation is, if you are older Gen X or a boomer, you made these kids this way, right? You raised them.
Did.
They grew up in your environment. You and your people did this. Mm-hmm. So take credit for the good, take responsibility for what you don't like. It's the truth.
Yeah.
And so I like to start first with empathy. Understand that they've grown up in an era of Columbine and the recession and on the heels of storytelling of 9/11. Like they're exposed to a lot big corporate enterprises, the financial crisis, tumbling their world and their parents' world. There is a reason they inherently mistrust, and there is a reason that there is a general overwhelming mistrust of larger corporations and more traditional leadership. Mm-hmm. And so just start there. Like, I get it. And so I have to actually combat that, because I can't undo personally as a leader, or I will tell this mature leader, let's say they're a baby boomer, you can't undo 2 decades of programming. You can't. And so you just have to empathize and understand that leads to so many behaviors. It leads to believing that there has to be a better way, which is a positive thing. It leads to them not wanting to hitch their wagon to a company for too long, because all things come to an end. So just understand it's not disloyalty. It's just a belief of the natural cycles of things, that they're faster and shorter. And they've seen big companies that were prominent in their early years go out of business by the time they're out of college. And so all big things don't last. And in fact, they're paying very much attention to why those things don't last, and believe that doing things differently will lead to a different result. Rightly so, I believe. And so how do you harness that? So that's my first piece of advice, is take some accountability and have some empathy. The second piece of advice, however, would be, now that you have accountability and empathy for the characteristics or the behaviors that you're describing, how can you educate, inform, support, and develop? So anytime I hear an older leader say, well, they just don't understand business. Well, effing teach them, right? If they don't understand, you just called out and identified the problem. Sit down with them and show them where the breakdown of a dollar goes. When $1 in sales come in, what happens to expenses? What is left over? And then where does that need to go? And where does it not go that they might think that it goes? Get them to be on teams where they're dealing with very real problems in the business. So they can't just live in a world of theory. Those are the things that good leaders can do. And so the third is kind of the summary of those two, is don't spend too much of your time complaining, because then you're not being a great leader. Spend your time doing something about it. And yes, of course, just like there are boomers and Gen Xers that aren't capable of certain jobs and skills, there are millennials and Gen Zers that are not the right fit for certain roles. But don't broad brush, an entire generation or age group. That's foolish, just as I would never do that to, the person who might be asking for the advice.
Absolutely. All right. So let's, you mentioned this just a second ago, but let's kind of hone in on it for a second. What have you found to be the benefits of focusing in on developing and educating your team, your workforce?
Development and education does two things. One, it's more and more important to every generation that's younger. So it's a retention tool in and of itself. Just ongoing learning and education is a reason to stay somewhere. The second is, of course, you're building capability in your internal team, and not having to hire the expertise from the outside. That is both a smart financial decision as well as a good cultural decision, because you have someone who can grow up within the company and credit the organization for their learning and development, and then demonstrate those the newly honed skills with that learning and development inside the company to benefit the company. And the third is it just provides perspective, and perspective leads to calm. Calm comes across as maturity. Maturity helps counterbalance some of the natural traits that might show up for them as a young person.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Next Generation Rockstars, where we have discussed all about recruiting and retaining that next generation of talent. So I'm guessing that you probably learned a tremendous amount from this week's Rockstar leader. And if that is the case, don't keep me a secret. Share this episode with the world, but really share it with your friends, with your colleagues, because they also need to learn how to recruit and retain this next generation of talent, because these skills are crucial to business success moving forward. Now, of course, I want you to keep up to date every single week as we are dropping each and every episode. So be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast platform of your choice, and you will see the Next Generation Rockstars show up just for you.